everyone, I'm Juliana and this is the Brazilian Readers. Last November, I got to visit the Brontë Parsonage and the village of Haworth where they lived. It's a small village in Yorkshire in the north of England. I've always loved the Brontes, but they've never been my absolutely favorite writers. I was always more of a Jane Austen girl. But a few years ago, I actually got to go to the Jane Austen Museum in Bath and I was incredibly disappointed. Because when I got there, I found that basically she'd never been to that house. They didn't have anything that actually belonged to her, very little. So it was not what I expected out of that experience. It kind of felt like a tourist trap in a way. It just basically, to me, it felt like they were capitalizing on people who loved Jane Austen. So I was just like, oh, didn't really like that. Although I have to go to her actual house, which I haven't done that yet. But that's where the Brontë Parsonage is completely different. Because this is the actual house where they lived. With their brother, with their father, with their aunt. They have their clothes, their furniture, the desks that they used to write. The house is kept as closely as possible as how it was back in the day, and it's incredibly well cared for. But before I talk about the village, the windswept moors, the house, and everything else, I think we should talk about the Bronte sisters themselves, because not everyone knows who they were, and not everyone has read their books. So this trip kind of started with my partner asking me, how did these three writers who became so famous come from this small place? Because that was his big question, okay? And by the end, he actually got to a conclusion, which I'll share at the end of this video. Yes, this is me trying to clickbait. That's how interesting my clickbaits are. It's like, guess what my boyfriend found about the Brontes? Yes, that's what I'm doing. So the Bronte sisters were Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. Charlotte, if I remember correctly, was born in 1815 or 16 and died in 1855. The others were born later, but died before her. They had a very sad life, so unfortunately, there's not a lot of happy stuff to talk about. But their parents were Patrick and Maria, or Mariah. I'm confused about the pronunciation of her name because I've heard both ways. But anyway, their father was a clergyman from the Church of England. They weren't actually born in Haworth. They were born nearby, but they've ended up moving there because the father got a job in Haworth. They ended up having 5 children in total, but the 2 oldest daughters died in the age of 10 or 11, so they died very young. And after they died, the family ended up moving to Haworth to try and start over a little bit. But when they got there, Mariah, the mother, also died. So Patrick was left with the 3 daughters and 1 son, Bramwell, who was the second oldest after Charlotte, who ended up becoming the eldest due to the death of her sisters. And then Patrick needed to figure out what to do. They were poor because at the time a clergyman didn't make much money and he had to take care of his family. That's why he decided to send his 2 eldest daughters, now Charlotte and Emily, to a school to become governesses so they could have some kind of future, some ways of making money. Bramwell wanted to be a writer, a painter, an artist in general, but he suffered from alcoholism and he ended up not achieving as much as his sisters did. There's a really good film about the Bronte family which is called To Walk Invisible. I'll put the poster here somewhere. Because in this film it kind of shows the story of how they started writing and how difficult it was for them and the reason for a pseudonym and all of that. Because the thing is, the Bronte sisters, they have written since they were children. But it was exactly at this moment when they were facing the what are we going to do with our lives? How are we going to make money? Because their brother wasn't making any money. Their father was getting old. So it was at this specific moment that Charlotte turned to her sisters and said, we all write. Why don't we make a collection of our poems and send it to a publisher? And then the sisters, and Emily and Anne, were like, absolutely not. Women who write are looked down upon. But then Charlotte said, no need to worry. I have a solution for that. Let's use male pseudonyms. And then they ended up choosing the surname Bell because it started with a B, like Bronte. And each sister chose a name with the same initial of their actual names. So in this case, so Charlotte became Currer, Emily became Alice Bell, and Anne became Acton Bell. And as the Bell brothers, they actually got published. Charlotte's first novel, The Professor, was actually rejected at first. It ended up only being published after her death. So the first published book by Charlotte ended up being Jane Eyre. Emily and Anne published a collection together which had both Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights. These books were successful and for a long time they didn't even tell their father what they were doing because they didn't want Bramwell to feel frustrated by their own success, which is just incredibly sad when you think about it. Eventually, Bramwell died very young. At his funeral, Emily caught a cold that ended up turning into pneumonia later, and she died soon after that. Anne also died a few years later. They've actually all died very young. Only Charlotte and their father were left. So it was Charlotte who ended up revealing their own identity, turning them into the Bronte sisters instead of the Bell brothers. The problem with all of this, well, is Charlotte got on to publish other books, and Anne published a second novel, which is The Tenant of Whitfield Hall, great book by the way, which many consider to be the first feminist novel ever written. But Anne is often the forgotten sister because, well, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights ended up becoming huge books, right? Some of the most famous books in English literature. So after Anne's death, Charlotte was still alive, and she decided not to republish The Tenant of Whitefeld Hall because she thought it wouldn't be appropriate for her sister to be so famous for a novel that was incredibly scandalous for its time. I'm gonna open like some brackets here. The Tenant of Whitefeld Hall is about a woman with a young child who's married to an abusive alcoholic husband, and she literally takes the child and runs away to somewhere else. That's just the premise of the book. That's not the whole story. But apparently it was very much inspired by their life with Bramwell. And Charlotte didn't want her sister to become famous for that because it was seen as outrageous for a woman to be writing such things at that time. But anyway, that's just a very small, brief summary about the Brontes. When Emily and Charlotte went to study in other places, they've learned that they had several problems with the education system in England at the time. So this ends up becoming a big theme in Jane Eyre. So after that, their father, Patrick, he ended up creating a school in front of the church he worked at so that his daughters could teach at Haworth and not have to leave home for that. So Anne studied there. She was educated by her sisters, as well as the other children in the village at the time. So let's talk about Haworth now. I went on a Sunday. I think that the museum's actually closed on Mondays. My intention was originally to go on Monday because I thought it would be quieter, but then I think I've read something about it being closed. I'm not sure. Don't take that seriously. Google that before you go. But since I got there at 10 a.m. on a Sunday, at the moment it opened, it was still very calm. Because the thing with the Parsonage Museum is you go and the order they want you to go, but you can't come back. But you can take as much time as you want on each room. The thing is, the rooms are very small because it's, well, an old house. So not many people can fit in them at the same time. So luckily when I arrived, it was just me and my boyfriend on each room. So that was perfect. I fell in love with the house. I was completely enchanted by it. I'll put images on the screen while I'm talking about it. But you get to see the room where they used to write. Their desks are exactly as they would have been back then. The sofa where Emily apparently died, I found that a bit bizarre actually, but it's still there. It's the gray sofa where Emily died. The table where they would read the newspaper with their father. The kitchen is the only thing in the house that isn't entirely as it was back then, because I think the people who lived there later made some renovations and they had to, well, deal with that at the museum. So you go through all of their bedrooms, you can see some of their clothing, shoes they used to walk on the moors, all of that. It's also incredible, so beautiful, extremely well cared for. You can see the passion that everyone who works there has for telling their story, for keeping these things the same, and for welcoming the visitors who come from all over the world. And they take care to tell the story. So after you go through the old part, you enter a new room where they give you more details and you can see famous quotes from their books on the wall. I thought it was very beautiful, very moving. It was amazing to be able to see all of that. It's actually one of the best museums I think I've ever visited. So on the day that we went there was a forecast of rain for the entire day. So we started with the house and we realized that the shops would only open later. So we quickly visited the church, which is right next to the parsonage house. And this is the church where Patrick worked, and all of them are buried there except for Anne, because Anne didn't die in Haworth. So they decided to bury her where she ended up passing away. Charlotte ended up thinking it would be best to bury Anne somewhere else and to spare her father from another family funeral. So they're all buried under the church. There's a plaque there mentioning where they are. There's also a list of all of the priests that were there since the beginning, and you can see Patrick's name on the list. It's very interesting. So after leaving the church, we got to visit the school that Patrick built for his children. I've learned that it's usually closed on Sundays, but on the day we went, since it was towards the end of November, they were holding a local fair art inside. So you would pay £1 to get in, you would get tea, and you get to see all of the lovely stalls. It was just beautiful. They had several cakes, biscuits, scones, all of the traditional things you relate to tea, I guess. So we sat there for a while. It was lovely. It made me think of the whole ideal small town village Christmas thing, like you watch in the Hallmark films. That's what it reminded me of. I guess that place was what the Hallmark films during Christmas try to be, because that was very real. So that's the difference. That's when I've turned to my partner and said, can we move here, please? Can we just stay here and never leave this place? Because I completely fell in love with Haworth. So as the stores were not open yet and it was drizzling a bit, I thought this is the perfect moment to go to the moors. Which we'll see that it was not the greatest idea, but hey. Because I thought that the rain was gonna get worse later. So I thought, let's go when it's just drizzling a bit. So there you can have different trails through the moors, but one of the most famous ones is a 1 hour long that takes you to the Bronte waterfall. And then you have another one that takes a little bit longer from the waterfall to the house. To a house that is at the top of a mountain around there. A lot of people say it was the house that inspired Wuthering Heights, but that's not true because the museum made sure to put up a sign saying that this is a lie. I didn't get to go to the house because by the time we got there, it was raining so much. My boyfriend was not wearing the appropriate shoes for that, so we decided to just go back, just go to the waterfall and go back. That's good enough. And it was beautiful. I was so soaked that I ended up getting a really bad cold after that, so I don't even want to know what would have happened if we went to the house. I think it's Top Withers, something like this. I think that's the name. I think it's important for me to say that Wuthering Heights is not my favorite Bronte book. Maybe it's because I've read it when I was too young, and I don't know. I would be curious about rereading it these days to kind of see, maybe because of that awful film that is about to come out. I've seen the photos, they look terrible. But that is making me want to reread the book for next year, just to be able to complain even more about that film. But I feel like especially after going there, I feel like I understand the book a lot more. I understand specifically Emily and the wildness of that place and how that actually changes someone who lives there and how ingrained that is in their lives. I think that that's a beautiful thing, and it makes so much more sense to me now. And that is another reason for why I want to read that book again. So after all the rain and with my trousers full of mud, we went back to the village to look at the shops. The shops in Haworth are some of the most adorable shops I've ever seen in my entire life. I wanted to buy everything from every single shop, but I didn't film much because I was embarrassed and I'm a terrible YouTuber, so I'm sorry for that. You can take my word for it and just the few clips that I have on this video from the village, because by that time there were a lot more people around and then I felt uncomfortable. But anyway, this video is just to share a little bit of my experience in the Bronte country, and it truly makes sense to call that place Bronte country because you just feel like you're in their books and you just feel how much that place loves its history and reveres these authors to this day. But now I'm gonna get back to my clickbaity question in the beginning, which was my boyfriend's question of how did these great writers come from this tiny place? Which is very simple. They had the space and the time to write. They had the education to do it. And they also had that beautiful nature around them. And that nature is the greatest inspiration anyone could have. So I don't know what else I can say about it besides I loved it. I'm already planning on returning to that beautiful place. And I would like to know from you a little bit. What is your favorite Bronte book? Have you ever been to Haworth? Like, would you like to go there? Which other authors' houses would you like to visit? So yes, please leave it in the comments and I'll see you next time. Bye.